Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Jack Malday, Associate Director at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In this week's episode, we welcome three distinguished guests to delve into the recent Mexican presidential election and its implications for US immigration. BPC Senior Advisor Theresa Cardinal interviews Andrew Selee, the President of the Migration Policy Institute, José Díaz Briseño, a US-based reporter for the Mexican newspaper REFORMA, and Pulitzer-prize winning freelance journalist Emily Green. Together, they discuss Claudia Sheinbaum, the first female president-elect of Mexico, her campaign's positions on immigration and the U.S. Mexico border, and what changes in the bilateral relationship on these issues we can expect going forward. Stay tuned to hear all about fears, hopes, and aspirations from two sides of the border in our fast-changing political times.
When discussing immigration and border policy, it's important to remember the consequential role that the U.S. Mexico relationship plays. Today, we are discussing how the election of Claudia Sheinbaum, the first female Mexican president-elect, may affect that relationship, migration at the U.S. Mexico border, and how much of a part migration played in the Mexican election. I'm thrilled to welcome to This Week in Immigration three fantastic experts. First, Dr. Andrew Selee has been serving as the president of the Migration Policy Institute, or MPI, since 2017. His research focuses on migration globally, with a special emphasis on immigration policies in the United States, Latin America, and the Caribbean. He's the author of several books and multiple opinion articles, and just this month, MPI published a new report with the International Organization for Migration that talks about the legal pathways that exist for migration in the Western Hemisphere. He teaches courses on global migration at universities, and before joining MPI, he spent 17 years at the Woodrow Wilson Center with the Mexico Institute there. So welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Theresa.
Next, we have José Díaz Briseño. José is currently the Washington correspondent for REFORMA, one of the most popular and reliable Mexican news sources. He's also spearheading the creation of a new English language news product by REFORMA called MexicoToday.com. His reporting with REFORMA covers predominantly U.S.-Mexico affairs, including questions of immigration and border security. Previously, he served as the White House correspondent for Mundo Fox, a U.S. Spanish TV network, and the U.S.-Mexico border affairs correspondent for El Imparcial in Arizona. He's a news researcher for the Los Angeles Times Mexico City Bureau as well. So welcome to the podcast, José.
Thank you, Theresa.
Very great to have you. And last but not least is Emily Green. Emily is a Pulitzer-prize winning freelance journalist. She is based in Mexico City, and she investigates the impacts of U.S. immigration policy on Latin America, the consequences of the region's drug war, and has chronicled political upheaval and changes. From 2020 to 2023, she was a correspondent at Vice News. And in 2021, she won an Emmy for her coverage of children trained to fight drug cartels. She's freelanced for multiple publications, including NPR, The World, and the Los Angeles Times. Welcome to the podcast, Emily.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. So, Emily, I am going to start with you. You are based in Mexico City. Help us understand a little bit about the recent elections in Mexico. Can you tell us about the candidates and what the key issues in the campaigns were?
Sure. I mean, obviously, the biggest candidate was Claudia Sheinbaum, and she won the presidency. She is the first female president in Mexico, the first female president in all of North America. So this is a very, very big deal. Her competitor, the biggest competitor, was Xochitl Gálvez. And so it was really a landmark election in the sense that you had the two primary candidates were women. And I think that can't be overstated what a big deal that is. That said, many voters went to the polls and saw it as really a referendum on the current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And that is because he is such a transformational figure in Mexican politics. He inspires adoration. I mean, people love him. It's almost like he's a rock star. And he also inspires complete hatred. People absolutely hate him with a fervor that is really seen. And so I think that when voters went to the polls, they were really saying, do we like López Obrador's vision or do we not? And if we do, we're going to vote for Claudia Sheinbaum. And voters overwhelmingly voted for Claudia Sheinbaum, which is sort of an affirmation of the current president's vision. But as I mentioned, it cannot be overstated the fact that this is a very big deal to have a female president in Mexico, especially in a country that has historically had extremely high rates of violence against women, of femicide, of machismo attitude. So I think that it's a very interesting and a complex election.
Yeah. So now that we know that Claudia Sheinbaum has been elected, what happens next? When will she take office, and what happens between now and then?
Claudia Sheinbaum takes office on October 1st. In the meantime, President López Obrador has been taking her all around the country, kind of presenting her as his protege, as his extension. What's interesting is that the Congress assumes office on September 1st. So there's a month lag. And in that month lag, López Obrador is expected to push through enormous constitutional changes. The biggest one is that he wants judges in the country to be elected instead of appointed. And because he has essentially a 2/3 majority in Congress, he has the votes to push through this change. And so right before Sheinbaum takes office, we're likely going to see a huge change in Mexico's constitution.
Yeah. So, Jose, what has the reaction been in Washington, D.C. to Ms. Sheinbaum's election in Mexico?
In overall terms, actors in Washington have celebrated the victory of the first woman elected president in Mexico. The Biden administration has rushed to congratulate the incoming administration, also sending a delegation just 10 days after the results were known. It was led by Liz Sherwood Randall, who is one of the closest advisors to President Biden. But President Biden himself congratulated her on a phone call the day after the election. This only happens with really important partners. And as we know, Mexico is perhaps one of the closest allies of the U.S. in most areas, particularly on security and migration that we're talking here on this occasion. Vice President Harris also called her 2 days after she won. And even Secretary of State Antony Blinken called last week his incoming counterpart, Juan Ramón de la Fuente, who will be the Mexican Foreign Secretary. All these to say that the Biden administration, of course, it's facing an election itself this coming November, but wants to create bridges as soon as possible with they need to be in good terms given the reliance they have, particularly on migration enforcement policy.
Yeah. So, Andrew, let me turn to you. Let's talk about migration policy in Mexico. What are some of the current border policies that Mexico has, and what are the agreements the United States and Mexico have on migration? And how important is this bilateral relationship right now?
I mean, right now, the U.S. government is really depending on the Mexican government to control migration, to keep numbers low, so it doesn't become a political issue in the United States. So from the U.S. perspective, it is a absolutely fundamental relationship in terms of controlling migration, and I think that's going to be true whether or not it's a new Biden administration in January or a new Trump administration. I think the tone will be different. I think the methods will be different. But I think the U.S. administrations always depend on Mexico, and that's only increased as the issue has increased in importance. It's different, however, for Mexico, and it's different for a Sheinbaum administration. I think when they think about migration, the number one thing they think about is not the border, but about Mexicans living in the United States, right? And so this is part of what makes agreement possible, but it also makes it difficult, which is that they're really talking about two different things. And it's not that the Mexican government doesn't care about Central Americans and Venezuelans and Haitians and others coming through Mexico. They do, and there are sensitive issues around that. But politically, the bigger issue for a Sheinbaum administration is what the U.S. government does with Mexicans living in the United States. Is there a chance of some sort of legalization? Is there a chance of something like the parole in place that we saw recently, something to codify DACA in a more solid way, which would benefit Mexican citizens? So there's really different conversations going on migration on both sides, and they want different things from each other.
Yeah. How is the relationship on migration changed historically to where we are now? You mentioned certainly for Mexico, the priority has been Mexican migration in the Mexican migrants in the United States. I know from my experience that for a long time, the issue of migration between US and Mexico was about Mexicans migrating to the United States and what the US wanted Mexico to do with regard to its own citizens. Now we're talking about a lot more third country nationals. And particular, we've been talking about how Claudia Sheinbaum is a protege of the current president, AMLO. What's been that change that since he's been in the presidency in Mexico?
I mean, Lopez Obrador made a decision early on not to push for immigration policy changes in the U.S. It's not that the Mexican government doesn't weigh in any way. I mean, it certainly does here and there, but they haven't been as vocal as at other times, even rhetorically. But he also made a decision to be very pragmatic. First with the Trump administration and the Biden administration, it's a sort of low salience political issue for the Mexican government, for him, and so he was willing to do whatever the U.S. government needed on this to a point. And there are some restrictions both in Mexican law and judicial rulings, but also in terms of public opinion. I mean, Mexicans don't spend a lot of time. Mexicans in general, other than those that live in border regions, don't spend a lot of time thinking about migration. It's not as visible as in the U.S., but they also have some limits on what they want the Mexican government to do. Right? I mean, they're okay with some control. They don't like it when they see visions of when they see pictures of Mexican police or military beating up on migrants or things that where migrants are victimized, because there is some sympathy about that. So he's within reason been willing to accommodate U.S. Requests for control, especially in this past few months, but all throughout his administration, in return for what we have to assume are the U.S. being much more forgiving on other issues that matter more to Lopez Obrador, and particularly things that he sees as being internal issues in Mexico.
Yeah. So let me ask all of you, because you know migration is a very central issue, and this is a migration podcast. Um, what do you think? What do we know about the president-elect's migration policies or platform? How might they be the similar or different to López Obrador's? And I'll start with Emily.
I think that it's going to be quite similar, is my guess. Sheinbaum hasn't indicated anything to the contrary. And in many ways, for Mexico, this is kind of sorry, I'm trying to think about the best way to say it, but this is an issue that is so important to the United States. The fact that Mexico detains migrants trying to make it to the US border, that Mexico can get a lot out of the US if they just do this one thing. And that was true for Lopez Obrador. That is also going to be true for Sheinbaum. That's probably going to be true for any future president. And so it sort of is like, well, why don't we give the US what they want on this one issue that, in fact, most Mexicans don't care about? And then we can push through our other priorities. And my guess is that's likely what's going to happen in the next 6 years under Sheinbaum.
Yeah, Jose.
Yes, because of my work, I have to follow all the statements either from the winning candidate, Ms. Sheinbaum, and also from her close, a group of advisors. And in general, when posed this question about migration cooperation with the U.S., they have largely, used rhetorical devices not to say anything. Basically, they've been talking about pointing to root causes of migration as an area of concern. They've been talking about respecting the U.S. respecting the rights of Mexicans of course, of the Mexican migrants when they cross. But they have been relatively mum on what they want to do in terms of enforcement or refugee admissions, the most relevant issues. And I agree with Emily. I don't think these would be much different. The real question here is whether they will use this issue, migration cooperation, as leverage in other areas of the relationship, as Andrew had mentioned before. That's the big question, and we'll have to wait and see, because I don't think that even within her team, there's already a vision developed on how to cooperate on this issue.
Yeah, Andrew.
I think it's interesting, though. I mean, someone who knows Claudia Sheinbaum well told me at one point that she's both more pragmatic and more ideological than López Obrador, which is a confusing statement, right? And I think what was meant by that, and from what I've seen, is that there are certain things in which López Obrador was a pragmatic politician. He jumped into politics at a young age in the progressive wing of the ruling party, of the then dominant party, and then gradually gravitated towards the left. He always had a leaning to the left, actually, but he really didn't come out of the left. He came out of the catch-all pragmatic party that ruled Mexico for 71 years, whereas Claudia Sheinbaum really comes out of the left. I mean, she was an idealistic, somewhat dogmatic student leader, and then gradually moved into politics. Right, became more pragmatic over time. And I think why that matters is that we know that López Obrador made a decision early on. I mean, at least we can tell that he made a decision starting with Trump that migration was one of those topics that he was willing to sacrifice, that it was just not it just didn't have that much political meaning to him, and it mattered a lot to the US. And, he would do more or less within reasonable bounds that didn't get him in trouble with Mexican public opinion. He was willing to wheel and deal. I don't know with Claudia Sheinbaum. I mean, there is an element where what I've heard from her and from people around her is an interest in Mexicans living abroad. She lived in the United States herself. She had a lot of contact with Mexicans in the U.S. From what we hear from people. I don't know if I think we may discover that there are issues that actually hit a chord with her that would not have with López Obrador, where she suddenly actually has more of a point of view and more of a personal reaction than López. It turns out not to be that pragmatic for good or bad, right? I mean, not sort of. So I don't know on this issue. My guess is, I mean, I think Jose and Emily are right that any Mexican president is going to give a fair amount of leeway to the U.S., whatever U.S. administration's around on this issue, because it's not politically salient in Mexico. It's not an issue that elections are won and lost on, and it is in the U.S. So that's just the dynamic of the relationship. But I do wonder if there are elements on this issue where suddenly she might have a slightly different reaction than López Obrador. And I don't think we know. I don't think she's been that forthcoming yet about where she's living still in the shadow of López Obrador, who's her political mentor. And, I don't think we know yet where she's going to draw lines once she becomes president.
We'll probably talk a little more about this later, but it was interesting. I think there was a lot of question about how López Obrador would get along with President Trump, given that one was seen as a leftist and one is seen as more right. But they did have a good relationship because they're both populists, I think is one of the ways that this pragmatic kind of transactional way of looking at the relationship that they both shared. I'm not sure that's quite the same under the Biden administration, although they have managed to work on a lot of things together. We've already talked a little bit about this, but immigration is so salient politically in the United States. We're having, as we're recording this, the first U.S. presidential debate will happen this evening, and almost everybody is expecting that immigration will be a large part of that discussion. And yet all of you have said that politically in Mexico, it's not such a salient political issue. What does that mean in terms of, I mean, you've kind of all touched on it, but like, when we think of the political space that leaders have to operate in, it's, what will the public tolerate? And so we've seen, for example, President Biden in the last 2 weeks, two very different executive actions on migration. One was what's seen as a crackdown on asylum seekers at the border, restrictions on who can apply for asylum. And the other was granting new potential status to people who are undocumented in the United States, trying to play both sides of this. How were either of those policies received in Mexico, both by the leadership and maybe by the public? How aware is the public of this? And what political salience do those kinds of actions have? Whoever wants to take that one.
I mean, we tend to think of these as being different sides because that's where sort of the advocacy, battles have been fought on the left and right.
Yeah.
But in fact, most Americans, I mean, as you know, because you've done a lot of work on this,
Yeah.
Theresa, I mean,
They like
most
both.
Americans, right? They like both. They want fewer people coming across the border in ways they say is disordered and not clear and transparent and orderly. But they also want immigrants already in the United States who have deep ties in this country to be able to stay, right? I mean, that is, So I think actually they were reading the public pretty well. They were reading the Wall Street Journal poll, the AP Norc poll, there were a whole rash of the Gallup poll, the Pew Research Center poll. There are 4 of them that came in a row that all say exactly the same thing. People's anxiety about the border is way up, hence they're cracking down on that. But they're still pretty positive on immigration as long as they think it's legal and orderly. And they're fine with people that are even here illegally as long as they see them as integrated and contributing to American society and support legalization. So I think in that case, they actually read the public. We can agree or disagree on specific actions, but I think they're sort of consistent where the public is. But I think they're also consistent where Mexican policymakers are, and which is the Mexican government would also, in an ideal world, love to have fewer people wandering through Mexico on their way to the United States, right? I mean,
That's
it's
one way
not
to
a
put
big
it, wandering through Mexico.
Yes, yeah. I mean, look, it is people. It is, as Emily knows better than I do,
Large
because she talks
numbers.
to these people. It's large numbers of people. There's a lot of extortion. There's a lot of criminal activity around this. It is something that causes them not a big political problem, but it is there, right? And they know it's fueling a criminal enterprise. And what you hear from Mexican officials quite often is, the U.S. is incentivizing this because it's become so easy to cross the border, right? Once you get to the U.S. border, if you make it to the U.S. border, if you're willing to risk that, your chance of getting in is pretty good. If the U.S. would just make it harder, that would bring it down, right? People will say that in private; they'll never say that in public, but they say in private a lot. At the same time, they really want things that help Mexicans already in the U.S., and they're willing to fight for that. And so those 2 actions, I think, actually probably, the Mexicans worry a little bit about people being turned back to Mexico and people being stuck in shelters, though that doesn't seem to have happened as much as we expected. But they do worry about that. But overall, it actually is sort of consistent not only with U.S. public, but also where Mexican policymakers have been on this.
Yeah. Jose, I want to ask you, because the Biden administration announced the border policies after the Mexican election. There was some speculation that it was purposeful because they maybe were concerned about the impact it would have, or maybe there was some conversations that happened about the timing of this. What's your sense from your contacts in Washington? How relevant was the Mexican election to the timing of some of these things?
I certainly think it was relevant. I don't have any proof to say that they talked about announcing these after the election. Just a speculation, just like you.
Mhm.
But the fact that that's a relevant meeting in December when Mayorkas and Blinken had to travel to Mexico City during the Christmas break, that tells you how much the U.S. was caring about not endangering this cooperation in these particular months. It's also a sign of how powerful López Obrador was. At that time, I remember that Mayorkas said in January that the real reason for traveling was that the Mexican Migration Institute had told them that they didn't have enough money to put the checkpoints in place to stop migrants traveling to the border. We remember that the crisis that developed in December,
Right.
when more than 12,000 encounters a day were happening at the U.S.-Mexico border, and that created a ruckus here in Washington. Of course, these pressure the Biden administration to respond. And if you track how many times Lee Sherwood Randall has traveled to Mexico in the past 6 months, you can see that the careful design of policy that they've been following, not to anger López Obrador in any case. So I'm not surprised that they waited after the election to announce this new policy in restricting asylum at the border.
Yeah. Emily, Andrew spoke a little bit about, the challenges migrants face migrating through Mexico, the cartels, the criminal activity that they're subject to. How much of that are the Mexican public aware of, or the Mexican government officials, and are they working on trying to address some of that? What are the kind of responses to that?
I don't know how much the Mexican public is aware of it, and I don't think they particularly care. And I think Mexican officials are extremely aware of what's going on, and I don't think that they particularly care. I mean, what's happened right now is that there is a singular focus on the part of the U.S. and Mexican government to stop migrants from reaching the U.S. border. That is the beginning goal, the middle goal, the end goal. That's the whole shebang. And if migrants are extorted, if they are kidnapped, if they are raped, if they are killed in the process of migrating, well, that's just a collateral damage. I spoke with a fairly high-level official who deals with migration recently, and I asked him about this. I said, what does the U.S. official say about this? And he said to me, this is referring to the U.S., they are okay with very high levels of kidnappings and dead migrants because there's only so much they can ask for. They really need our help. And I think that is the nut of it.
Yeah. Jose, go ahead.
I wanted to say something that perhaps can illuminate why the issue of migration is not that salient in Mexico. The foreign-born population in Mexico, it's around 1%, according to the latest census. In the US, the foreign-born population is around 15%. So that tells you that the tensions that we see in immigrant communities here in the US are not exactly the same as in Mexico. And also, yes, there are tensions at some specific cities and neighborhoods in Mexico when, for some reason, migrants are are wandering around the street with nothing to do. But in general, I think there's a welcoming attitude, thinking that from the Mexican population, thinking that most of these migrants are just in transit. Now, I must say also that at the height of the Remain in Mexico expansion negotiations in June of 2019, there was a poll conducted by El Universal newspaper, which unveiled that 61% of Mexicans were okay with stopping migrants at any cost. So that tells you the leeway that the López Obrador administration has, because the fact of having on one side a threat of tariffs by Trump, and on the other side, stopping migrants is a no-brainer for most Mexicans, given the relevance that the U.S. economy has for Mexico. So I think that we haven't seen that poll updated. I think there's a vacuum that someone needs to fill about attitudes of Mexicans towards migrants. But I would not be surprised that when posed with this challenge, the Mexicans in general tend to support, tough crackdowns on migrants.
Yeah.
And except that I think that there's when there's something like the fire in Ciudad Juarez, or where dozens of migrants died, or the killings that happened in Tamaulipas, or even a tractor trailer turning over. There is a certain element of sympathy, right, in Mexico, or empathy, because most Mexicans have some experience with migration. I mean, for people who are better off, the experience of migration may more be studying abroad, but almost everyone has someone abroad, right? And people in lower income families almost all know someone who lives in the U.S., right? A family member, a friend, someone from their neighborhood. So there is a degree when something suddenly comes to the forefront
that hits the news, something big that hits the news.
Yeah, then it does hit people. And so, for example, the Mexican government has stopped holding people in detention centers right now. Some of that has to do with a Supreme Court ruling on holding families, but also it was after the fire in Ciudad Juarez, right? That's a response to public opinion. I mean, so there's some edges. I mean, I think Jose is completely right on this. This is, generally speaking, it's just not an issue that most Mexicans, it's 1% of the population, and 2/3 of those are actually people born in the U.S. of Mexican descent, the majority of Mexican. Most Mexicans just don't have an experience of migrants, of the kind of migrants that we see coming through Mexico, transiting to the United States. I mean, there are some that are staying more and more. If you live in the Riviera Maya or in some parts of Mexico City or Tijuana or Juarez, that's different. But most Mexicans don't yet have the experience of immigration in their neighborhoods and their communities and their kids' schools. And, it's not that kind of thing. But there is a certain empathy there. And that's kind of what Mexican government has to negotiate. And what they're doing now, I mean, Emily knows this better than me, but that they're doing, since they're not holding people in detention and they really only deport people to Central America, is they're essentially taking people in circles. So they'll stop them up in the north and then bus them back to the south of Mexico. And from there, they start their journey, which makes them much more vulnerable, actually, along the way.
Yeah. Emily, you're welcome to respond to that if you want, but I have a different question to ask you,
Sure,
if I may.
that's fine.
We talked at the top of this about the historic nature of Claudia Sheinbaum's election, the first female leader in Mexico. Mexico beat the United States to that, I'm sorry to say. But do people kind of hold any opinions about the role of gender in international politics when it comes to Mexico? And specifically, we have two older white men running for president in the United States. So clearly our next president is going to be male. Is there any sense to which having a female president in Mexico dealing with one of these gentlemen as president of the United States may affect the bilateral relationship?
I don't frankly know, and I don't want to speak out of turn here. I don't entirely know. I mean, I think I think that Lopez Obrador was cognizant of leaving his legacy to a woman. Um, I think that probably played some role in his decision he never, I mean, there was a few people vying for his position, but I do think that it was very clear that he favored Sheinbaum. And I think that the fact that she is a woman and that maybe it was important to him to leave his legacy to a woman. And it also speaks about the transformation of Mexico, whether or not how relations will change between a female president and a older white male president in the U.S. I don't know. I mean, I actually think it might be more salient the fact that Sheinbaum speaks English, that she lived in the U.S., that she is a little bit more international, has a much more international perspective than Lopez Obrador did. I think that will play likely a more salient role in the relations between whoever is the president of the United States and Ms. Sheinbaum.
Yeah, and we should mention that obviously Claudia Sheinbaum was elected, but the next closest competitor was also a woman running in the presidential election. So the two top candidates were female, which is remarkable.
And one, Claudia Sheinbaum is Jewish, not terribly observant, but she is from a Jewish family. And the second place finisher, Xochitl Galvez, is the daughter of an indigenous father. And very proud and speaks actually Otomi, the language of her father. So, I mean, it was unusual. I mean, lots of things that are make us pale in comparison in the United States in some ways, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I would say so. We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we're going to hear our experts' thoughts on the upcoming elections in the United States and how that might affect the bilateral relationship. So don't go anywhere. And we're back. So now we're going to turn to the elections in the United States. And we kind of got into a little bit of this, but I'd welcome anybody's perspective. How important to the bilateral relationship is the personal relationship between the leaders of the two countries? We talked a little bit about that dynamic between López Obrador and President Trump and López Obrador and Biden. We can speculate a little bit about Claudia Sheinbaum, but aside from the individuals in the office and who they might be, how important to the overall bilateral relationship is it that those leaders, whoever they are, get along? Who wants to take that?
So in general, I think it's important and relevant, not entirely decisive, but if you go to anecdotes from history, you could talk to people here in the US that were close to President Obama on how he didn't like President Felipe Calderón when they were in office. But in general, he knew they need to cooperate even when their dislike was known. The thing is that the relationship is so complex and so intertwined at bureaucratic levels that cooperation goes on no matter who's in office in both countries. Now, this coming change in power in both nations is particularly salient because there's a big window of opportunity to develop an ambitious program of cooperation, given that only very few times throughout the recent decades you see incoming administrations coming simultaneously on both sides of the border. So potentially there would be a chance for whoever is elected in the US, either Trump or Biden, Biden, if he's reelected, to cooperate for 6 years entirely with the Mexican administration of Sheinbaum. So that gives you a lot of political space on what to develop in any area that you can talk of, either trade, migration, or security.
Yeah. Andrew, did you have something you want to?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, generally, I think the relationship has its own dynamics, that mean that even, no matter the ideology of who's elected on either side of the border, whether they like each other or not, there are certain national interests, right? I mean, no Mexican government is going to want to, lose the economic partnership with the U.S. because the economy depends on it, but vice versa as well. I mean, a lot of sectors of the U.S. economy depend on Mexico. Migration is a salient issue in the U.S., and the U.S. governments will always look to Mexico on this. There's lots of things going on in the hemisphere that they both deal with. So I think it's independent of relationships. I do think it changes when you have populist leaders, right? And I think, there is a lot to be said whether people like or not how López Obrador managed the relationship with Trump. The fact that he got along with Trump, that they understood each other, that they were both populists, very pragmatic populists who knew, and a little bit macho, and there's sort of this, going back and forth. They understood each other. Some people dislike how that played out, and think it would have been better for López Obrador to have pushed back on him, certainly. But it is, but it did work to sort of tamp down some of the tensions. I think that may be harder with Claudia Sheinbaum. I mean, Claudia Sheinbaum and Joe Biden will get along fabulously well, not because they will like each other. They might not, but because they're both sort of traditional politicians who understand a complex relationship, right? Doesn't matter if they like each other. If you get Donald Trump in January of next year, I think all bets are off. I think you have a populist leader on one side for whom, understanding informal relationships and back and forth and kind of each power struggles matters. And you'll have someone on the other side who's thinking in logical terms about how to manage it. And that could really be a recipe for chaos. I mean, it doesn't have to be, but certainly I think that's where the lack of personal relationship could turn out to be complex.
Yeah. I just want to note, from what Jose said, I mean, this is kind of a rare, not infrequent. I mean, it happens every 24 years that we have coincident elections. And the last time this happened was the election of President George W. Bush and Vicente Fox in 2000. And that did, in many ways, sort of restart a new era in U.S. Mexico relations. They came in office. They had known each other when Bush was governor of Texas, and they launched a series of bilateral initiatives, recognizing this is sort of a new era. And it was a new era in Mexico, too, with the election of a non-PRI candidate. I hear what you say about sort of the potential of this to mark a new phase in U.S.-Mexico relations. The difference here, I think, is that whoever's elected in the United States has been in office before, so we know kind of how they will run, and we have a little less knowledge of Sheinbaum. So let me ask, because Andrew mentioned this a little bit to Jose and Emily, and maybe it's not your personal opinion, but how it's seen in Mexico. How different do you think the consequences will be for the U.S.-Mexico relationship depending on which candidate is elected in the United States? How do Mexicans see the potential difference there? Emily, do you want to weigh in there?
I want to be careful because in many ways I live in a bubble. I mean, as much as I get out, I live in a bubble. I mean, the people that I mostly hang out with and see in the circles in which I run, they're not among Mexicans. I would say Trump is not a beloved figure at all. But I am cautious because I have not gone out to the countryside and I do not and asked and really focused on what do they think about Trump. And, I sometimes am surprised, even within the US, about who is a Trump supporter. I mean, you can see this in the US that there's been traditionally this line of thought that most Latinos would vote Democrat. And in fact, that is not the case. And so in Mexico, by and large, the circles in which I run, Trump is not beloved. That doesn't actually mean, though, that he doesn't have a base of support here. He has, in some ways, he is a López Obrador-like figure. He is a populist. He goes out. He talks to the people. He is amongst the people. He inspires adoration. And so that's something to take into account. I don't think that immigration policy is going to change radically. The manner in which it's carried out, the tone around it, it will change. But at the end of the day, I think that a lot of the immigration policy regard to migrants traversing Mexico is going to be very much the same. What could change, though, are as Jose alluded to before, is sort of the leverage. Will this change in terms of, I think, for example, the whole issue around electricity, around energy contracts, and that has become a very brewing issue of Mexico basically canceling longstanding contracts and whether it's going to go to arbitration, et cetera. I mean, I think those nearshoring, I think some of those business type issues, they will be affected by who's in power in the United States. But in terms of just the straight policy of how do we treat migrants traversing Mexico, I think that's likely to stay the same.
Yeah.
I would try to twist the question a little bit, because I think both Emily and Andrew are completely right. We'll see more continuity than we imagine, but I think it depends a lot on Claudia Sheinbaum. In general, López Obrador was very skeptical about deep cooperation with the U.S. in other issues, except for migration. The relationship of Mexico with the U.S. Congress is completely broken. And if you want to do something big in U.S.-Mexico relations, the Mexican president has to engage with the U.S. Congress, either in weapons or the trafficking of trying to stop weapons trafficking being trafficked to Mexico, dealing with immigration, dealing with trade. Everything goes through the U.S. Congress. And also, for example, if you want to deal with root causes on migration, if you don't have a good relationship with the U.S. Congress, you will never get enough money sent to Central America or Southern Mexico to quell most of these issues. So it will depend how deep will Claudia Sheinbaum wants to approach the U.S. establishment in general, and particularly Congress. I am skeptical that it will be very different, but I think that's the area that we need to put more attention to. Also, I think there's a completely forgotten dimension in U.S.-Mexico relations, because there's also a gap on what we know about how Claudia Sheinbaum is thinking regarding Mexico's own immigration arrangement, the bureaucratic arrangement. For example, currently, and this is something that I know that Andrew has worked on, the Mexican Refugee Agency depends 2/3 of its budget from United Nations sources. So it's the budget in general for Comar, the Mexican Refugee Agency, is $10 million. And the UNHCR, the Refugee Agency of the United Nations, it provides more than 6 million of it. So perhaps this is something that people should be paying more attention. And I'm sure that the U.S. government will put more pressure, not only regarding Comar, but also with INM, the Mexican Immigration Agency, because in general it has been underfunded. And these days, Mexico is facing a budgetary, crisis, and Claudia Sheinbaum will have to deal with this. And we will know her priorities when we see where she puts the money on the budget for these two agencies.
Yeah, policy needs
and
money.
She has talked about reforming. If policy needs money, it's people and resources as much as policy on paper. She's talked about reforming the two agencies, right? Actually giving more to the asylum agency and doing something different with the migration agency. It's hard to know what she means by that, and whether that's a serious proposal on the table. But it's interesting to watch. You can see two extreme scenarios, right? And then in between, you could see lots of. One extreme scenario is sort of Biden is reelected. The relationship carries on as it is, but border numbers are down. There's a real possibility of advancing in some things around them, are not comprehensive immigration reform, but some form of relief for certain categories of people in the United States. That the SMO process, the safe mobility offices, grow. The U.S. government tries to bring in people through legal pathways and through refugee resettlement in a serious way, and Mexico cooperates with that. There's sort of there's a virtuous cycle of cooperation. On the other side, you can also see a Trump administration with Claudia Sheinbaum, where the Trump administration threatens tariffs, has happened before, where things blow up, where perhaps there's a threat of military strikes in Mexico, whether or not it actually happens, but around organized crime groups, and things really go off the rails in the relationship, right? I mean, that is also a possible scenario. In between are the more likely scenarios, right? No matter who wins in the U.S. election, but there are scenarios of incredible, cooperation growing closer or really going off the rails. And as a thought experiment, I've always wondered, is there a scenario in which the Mexican government stops cooperating on migration, or public security or anything else, right? I mean, at some point, the political damage is so great, particularly if there's threats of drone attacks or something like that, that for a Mexican leader, the response is simply going to be, let's just shut down the relationship. Let's let people pass through Mexico, see how they deal with it. We're going to stop cooperating in organized crime. They can deal with it if there's more drugs arriving in the U.S. And, I think I don't think that'll happen, but I'm kind of curious, if you play that scenario out, is there a point at which the relationship really does break down because it becomes what's asked is untenable, and you do get to a different place where both countries either really pull apart, or they have to rebalance the relationship again because it's a sort of a murder-suicide.
Can I just add? I think one thing that is like somewhat forgotten, and Andrew and I have talked extensively about this, is that actually organized crime makes so much money off migration. It is a massive money maker. In this, and at the end of the day, empowered organized crime is bad for both countries, and I think that is a looming issue. They could stop the numbers, but organized crime just makes billions. I mean, some officials,
Their incentive is to continue it.
There's some officials, this is contested, but believe it's more money than they make on drugs. And an empowered organized crime is really a problem for both countries. And I would also say, it will be interesting to see what Sheinbaum does with, for example, Mexico's immigration agency. It is notoriously, unbelievably, endemically corrupt. It is one of the most corrupt agencies in Mexican politics. Will Claudia Sheinbaum want to take it on, or she won't? That is actually a question, and that could have some practical implications for migrants.
Yeah. I want to ask a slightly different question, because I think, Andrew's thought experiment is worth expanding upon a little bit. We've all sort of talked about how Mexico right now has such leverage in the bilateral relationship because of the salience of immigration in the United States and the necessity that the United States has on depending on Mexico to reduce the flow of migrants to the U.S. Mexico border. For Mexico, the primary immigration issue politically is the Mexicans in the United States and their status. President Trump has very clearly said that he wants to start a mass deportation campaign, which would disproportionately affect a lot of Mexicans in the United States. If he were to launch such a thing, that might be a scenario, I'd welcome your thoughts on this, where Mexico says, well, if you do that, we won't stop people coming to the U.S. Mexico border. That dynamic could be a very interesting one, because that would then create a different domestic political dynamic I would expect for Sheinbaum. What do you all think of that potential scenario?
I always think the Mexican government has more leverage than they think they have. But the question is, do they think they have it? And they usually don't, right? I mean, that's the kind of thing where if a Trump administration were to really try, and look, there's lots of reasons why I think all of us question whether they could even do mass deportation, just logistically speaking. But they could make life very hard for people who are in the country without documents, right? I mean, they could certainly sow enormous fear and be more effective at deporting people than they were in the last Trump administration. So, whether it becomes the mass deportation that is talked about with hyperbole, I don't know, but it certainly could be very disruptive in people's lives. I mean, yes, there is a question of the Mexican government modulating how much it cooperates. And the real scenario is probably not a complete breakdown of cooperation, but more like, degrees of cooperation that go down where, the Mexican government can show, and you've seen this even with the Biden administration, right? I mean, I don't know, if Haitians pass through Mexico in a bunch of buses in the 3-day period. I don't know. I mean, was that in any way something the Mexican government knew about? I have no idea, right? But you also saw the U.S. suddenly reassigning border agents, border patrol agents, or actually port of entry agents to border patrol and shutting down ports of entry, including the train corridor. There are ways that the two governments send signals to each other
Yeah.
without necessarily breaking the relationship. And I think that's the more likely scenario. It's not sort of the complete wheels coming off, but it is, the U.S. government does something it thinks it can get away with, and the Mexican government uses the tools at their disposal to push back, and it extracts a price, and they reach a new equilibrium.
Yeah. I mean, I guess one of the questions that kind of brings to mind is the extent to which sort of the political rhetoric in the United States is heard in Mexico and responded to by the Mexican government, or how that impacts the relationship. Jose, what have you understood, particularly when President Trump talks about mass deportations, or at one point I think he was talking about sending the military into Mexico to address fentanyl? I'm sure that didn't land very well with Mexican officials.
Well, this is the kind of news, all the hardcore proposals coming from the Republican side of the aisle in Congress, and also from the Trump campaign itself, that are very good for us journalists, because we're able to report. But in reality, from that to become, actual policy is a whole different thing, right? So we see a lot of fireworks, at least at the rhetorical level, but that doesn't translate necessarily down to actual policy. But let's remember the episode of 2019, the expansion of Remain in Mexico in June of 2000 of that year, and that's a very important precedent, because many people think, and this is people I talk to here in Washington, is that the Mexican government caved very easily to Trump's threat at that time of raising tariffs on cars. In general, at that time, there was lots of concern coming from Senate Republicans, Republican state governors, including Texas, and conservative players like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce here in Washington, that were ready to go to court as soon as Trump announced that kind of tariffs towards Mexico. But at that time, the AMLO government felt that even the slightest 1% or 2% of raising tariffs against Mexican cars, that would create chaos, and Mexico was not readily economically to support it. Some people would say that Mexico had some cushion to battle that, but given that Mexico will have lots of budgetary restrictions and a more flimsy economic landscape with Sheinbaum, it's going to be more hard to resist those kinds of pressure.
Yeah. So we want to wrap up here. Any last thoughts that you all have on looking at the potential future of this relationship in the next, well, let's start with 2025. And what do you think kind of the key issues, any things that we haven't yet talked about that you think are going to be relevant? Emily, I want to start with you, because you mentioned something that we didn't touch as much on, which is, this issue of the criminal organizations in Mexico. The other, aside from migration at the U.S. Mexico border, for the United States, the other huge issue is fentanyl. And those are two really big issues politically, societally in the United States. And they're interrelated now, because the same organizations are making money off of both. And when it comes to what the Mexican government's relationship and dealing with those organizations in Mexico is a subject of a lot of interest on no matter who's elected, I think, in the United States. How do you see that playing out?
I mean, I think they're rhetorically both countries are very much, and probably more than rhetorically, they want to curb the power of these criminal organizations, which are extremely, extremely powerful. But one thing is that the United States in general, I mean, it wants to curb the power. It is very focused on organized crime as it relates to fentanyl, because that is where there's direct harm to U.S. citizens. It is less focused on the power of organized crime when it relates to migrants, because that doesn't relate to US citizens. But at the end of the day, organized crime is becoming empowered no matter what. And the fact that they're empowered will one way or another, hurt Americans. I mean, it also hurts Mexicans, but just coming at this from a very U.S.-centric perspective, I think that's the case. And in some ways, I think that U.S. policymakers are a bit short-sighted when it comes to that. Like, they care about the power of organized crime when they're trafficking fentanyl because it's a direct harm. They're less concerned about the power of organized crime when they're trafficking migrants because that is an indirect harm. So I don't know that I'm being very coherent right now about how that is going to long-term affect relationships, but I think that this is a brewing issue and something that we should maintain an eye on because it's going to become more and more important over the years.
Yeah. Jose, did you?
Yes, I would just say that the anti-crime strategy by López Obrador has been largely ineffective. And of course, paying attention to how Claudia Sheinbaum develops a new model, that would be certainly something to watch because, as Emily was saying, the people who are facing the brunt of these organizations are mostly Mexicans being extorted, particularly more and more throughout cities and the countryside. And this is an issue that the U.S. not necessarily is really interested in. As Emily was saying, just enforcement at the border on drugs and containing any trafficking of precursors from China is something that they care more. But in general, if Sheinbaum is able to design a more effective policy, it's something that immigration watchers should pay attention to, how they reformed the National Guard, that it's nominally a civilian agency, but it's for all sakes a military institution, and how they develop or not investigative capacities to reduce impunity. That's a whole area that's relevant for U.S.-Mexico relations. And the second point I would like to hear more about, or pay more attention, is the whole development of Mexico's own migration paradigm. There have been some hints from the AMLO government about a new vision of how Mexico sees as a new destination for migrants. How open should Mexico be or not? Some programs of incorporating migrants into Mexican formal into the Mexican formal economy have been developed. Some private firms have been hiring Haitians and other migrants arriving in Mexico as refugees. But how much Sheinbaum will pay attention to these, how develop a Mexican paradigm of being an open country, but at the same time cooperating on enforcement with the U.S. This is a whole issue that we're not seeing much reporting on, because in general, Mexican media does a very bad job in covering migration itself, given that it's not a salient issue. But perhaps either non-governmental organizations or U.S. reporters would be more helpful in understanding the budgetary process, where they put money on, and how they develop the ideas and how they are executed.
I think these are a lot of the key questions. I mean, as Jose says, there was actually there was a government strategy released called the Mexican Model of Human Mobility. The first time the Mexican government has looked at being a transit country, but also a recipient of migrants and a country with a large diaspora abroad. And again, it's a document on paper. Lots of elements of it are not necessarily implemented, but a lot of what comes next. I mean, it matters not just how Mexico responds to U.S. pressure, which is always going to be a topic, but also what Mexico does on its own migration policies, right? I mean, to Emily's point, does the Mexican government lean into protecting migrants in some way, or at least, reducing the complicity between Mexican authorities and criminal groups that we know happens at a local level, right? I mean, does that happen? Is there some reform of the immigration agencies? Do they lean into asylum? Do they make it possible for people who want to stay in Mexico to get, permits and visas, residency visas, which in theory, I mean, the Mexican government just put out this great strategy saying that they want that. They want people to stay. And I think there's some parts of the Mexican government that it's true, but they've also stopped giving humanitarian visas to people who want to stay because they're afraid that that's contrary to stopping people getting to the U.S. border. Some of these small things that sound small actually are pretty big in terms of what happens next. They may not be the headlines on the numbers of people getting to the border, but they may make a lot of difference in the quality of life of people and the experience of people who are on the move, right? Or who decide to stay in Mexico and decide it's not worth trying to get to the U.S. And, at least for a while, I'll stay in Mexico and see what happens. One thing we know about Claudia Sheinbaum is she did this when she was mayor of Mexico City. She created a special ID for migrants that did not have another ID that allowed them to access public services in Mexico City. This was during COVID. It was sort of linked towards the COVID response. So she has that, but again, we're going on thin evidence for lots of things with her, right? I mean, she does tell us she did that at one point, at least at being a pragmatic mayor. Whether that informs how she will act at a national level as president, I don't think we know, but at least it suggests that she has some inclination to think about those quality of life issues that matter in institutional connections.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to have to leave the discussion here. We could go on for another hour and a half. There's lots to say. And probably after we see the, next year, after the U.S. elections, that we've had some time to evaluate this relationship, we'll look at it again. But Jose, Andrew, Emily, thank you so much for joining us on This Week in Immigration. We greatly appreciate your insights here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
And that's a wrap on this episode of This Week in Immigration. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find our podcast episodes on the Bipartisan Policy Center YouTube channel. You can find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown, and you can follow me at Jack Malday. Send your comments and feedback to us by email to immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Jack Malday. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This episode was written by myself, Rennie Mockery, and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BBC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. Talk to you next time on This Week in Immigration.